Parallel Lives, a true story-ish. For many years we have heard the sci-fi idea of a parallel universe. I want to tell you a story about one of those parallel universes. In this alternate reality, the people were very like us. They rushed about. They led stressful lives. They fought each other for limited resources. Thinking themselves really clever, they'd ended up by poisoning their water supplies when it had become fashionable to urinate and defecate in water, rather than keeping it for drinking. Another clever trend had been to use toxic chemicals on their crops to increase the yield, which had in fact happened, but the quality of the grains had gone down dramatically, and now they were filled with toxins too. They'd fostered a deep desire for power of any sort from very early on in their development. One side effect had been to encapsulate the power of work and production in an idea called money. People had come to worship and desire money to such a degree that they no longer recognized the value of their own lives. Money was far more important. Many lost their lives unwittingly as they chased this money through their youth and into their middle ages and became physically or mentally unwell due to the exhaustion of the constant chase. In an effort to make even more money, large groups of people started to dig into the earth. It took such an effort and was so dangerous that the minerals and metals that they found became fantastically expensive and, of course, very desirable. But how much could you take from Mother Earth before it was too much? Nobody knew, nobody cared. The metals and minerals made people rich, and a new source of power emerged. When you burned it, you gave off great power and smoke, lots of smoke, but power too. Their thirst for power grew even stronger as the clouds of smoke started to envelop their earth. The smoke started to make everybody and everything sick. Well, the more power they had, the more time they had to research the world in more detail. As time went by, they understood the fabric of their universe better and better. They discovered that everything they saw wasn't quite as obvious as they'd first thought. There was a whole micro-world embedded inside everything they could see. Oddly, they discovered there was even more power deep inside this micro-world than there was outside. Now, as they learned to release this power, they discovered it was a double-edged sword. They'd now seen the power that could destroy them completely if used unwisely. With this new power came untold levels of toxicity. Suddenly, their airwaves were filled with new frequencies that had never been unleashed before with such power and at such length. People didn't mind, because it came with upsides and, of course, the ability to make and hoard more money. At some stage, people started to wonder why their lives seemed to be so cheap. It began to dawn on them that many of the people who were starting to hoard vast quantities of money had begun to view them as a plentiful resource to be used and spent. It was built into every person's DNA that they should try to accumulate as much as they possibly could. A few had seen this and understood that if it was possible to bleed the more lowly people dry of their money, then the gathering of cash became much more simple. Get the workers to make a little money and then take it all off them through various scams. One of the best scams was to make people sick and then charge them a fortune to get well. What a clever idea this had been. The smarter humans, who had always used people as a resource by telling them stories, now needed to learn new ways. For thousands of years, it was easy to tell them a story about God or country, and they would have given up their lives for your gain. People had become a little more savvy these days, and a new strategy was required. The richer folk developed a narrative that said, "Your body wants to kill you, but if you pay us, we have the antidote." If they could make the masses believe that their bodies had actually turned on them, then surely they'd give up everything for a few more drops of life. Well, this scam worked for many years. Make the people pay to poison themselves, and then make them pay again to get themselves better. Well, the truth was that what they were offering was more poison, just dressed up as a cure. Usually, people only had enough money to keep themselves going for a few years of this treatments. What was the point of actually healing them? It wasn't a good financial model. Well, a tiny percentage of the populace saw this scam for what it actually was. Their voices were so tiny that the vast machinery of government, press and state didn't worry about them anymore. It was easy to make these people out to be crazy dreamers at best, and easy to suggest that their activities might actually be reckless and illegal at worst. There is, however, an interesting truth. At some innate level, the people always know when they're being lied to. Well, most people chose to accept this lie, or play along with it for profit. A few refused. Ancient cultures had always spoken of the power that humans have inside them. It was easy for big education to shut these ideas down in children when they were very, very young. Very few people got through the loophole. The ones that did were treated as anomalies. Science just pushed them to one side. Well, science was the propagator of the ideas that humans were just humans. The special abilities that some claimed to have were just ignored, hushed up, called witchcraft, or thoroughly sidelined. They were so inconvenient to science, as they seemed to prove the opposite of what science was claiming. Take, for instance, medicine, which was a branch of science. Well, it held that there was a chemical cure for everything. The issue had been that for such a long time that the chemicals had been one of the major reasons that people were getting ill in the first place. It was a hard sell, but on they pushed. The more pills people popped, the more money the companies earned, but sadly the people didn't get any better. They only ended up getting addicted. Now that was a great business model. On the companies pushed, regardless. The cleverest part of the magic trick was the ability of the system to keep people in a mesmerized state. Keep promising amazing gifts at the end of your working life. Spa pools, beach holidays, cruises round the world. Of course, few people ever got there, but it was fun dreaming. That's all the people did. Work and dream of a better time ahead. In the meantime, the system gave them wars, famine, disasters, and back-breaking work. Life felt like it was continuously speeding up. As technology progressed, so did the speed of people's lives. Constant contact was the watchword for most. It was seen as a little odd if you were off-grid for any amount of time, possibly hinting at some sort of perversion. One day, when life was reaching a peak of frenzy and disasters were rolling in daily, one clever soul remembered the following phrase: "You can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time." A small but persistent core were waking up to their own power, not an external power. This band of people started to understand that they no longer required the rush and panic. It was a simple idea. Detach yourself from the news agenda that was frightening everybody into staying in line. Detach yourself from the debt that kept everybody roped into the banks and government. Learn that you can grow your own food and that life doesn't require consumeristic addiction to thrive. More than that, they started to cultivate their own personal power. They discovered that a life lived in balance, that included silence, meditation and prayer, helped their bodies to heal naturally. They discovered that they could live healthily into old age if they kept themselves moving and thinking, rather than slumped, inert, in front of a TV. The more they practiced stillness, the more they discovered their hidden power. In the past, people had whispered crazy stories about an auntie who could heal sick people, an old man who was able to know what was ailing you, or about a mother who had lifted a car off a child's leg. There were stories about monks who could withstand otherwise mortal blows, martial artists who could become invisible or move through walls. It took a while, but eventually people started to discover that they could cultivate these powers too. Interestingly, it was found that every person could do this. There were no special people. It was just something they had all forgotten. It was an interesting turn in this parallel universe's history. Several of the individuals who'd become the richest in the world decided that if there was a chance to extend their lives, they'd like to see where this thinking went. They used their astonishing resources to start building communities all over the world. Well, these started small, little eco-villages with 200 or 300 families. Each one had its own school, its own work hub, but also a very different pace of life. Everybody in the community lent a hand into cultivating the crops, to teaching and building. Before long, the communities began to swell. People saw that it was possible to live and be healthy, but also to be happy too. Even the people in the cities saw that it was possible to adapt their way of life from competitive living to cooperative living. Cities became dreamy metropolises. Everywhere there were green roofs, living walls, parks or gardens growing communal crops, and fruit trees lining every street. The clouds of smoke were gone now. The rivers ran clean, and the earth sighed a huge sigh of relief as all of the mining and forest clearances gradually stopped. Interestingly, the largest shift occurred within the minds of the populace. As they had taken more time to themselves, they had changed. Firstly, they had worked until they were 55 or 50 at a maximum. The nature of their jobs had changed, so that every person felt they were valued and had done what they loved doing. Stress from work had disappeared. They'd built in time to look after their mental and physical health each day, which had led to a serious decline in the need for the pharmaceuticals. Many of the big drugs companies had closed. Lots of their directors had been tried for crimes against humanity and found guilty. People had demanded a reform in government. It was decided that you could only be in government after you'd worked until you were 50. All career politicians were audited and were forced to return their ill-gotten gains. Nobody wanted to eat cheap, sugar-filled bad food anymore. They demanded change. It was also seen that people's lives allowed them now to spend time cooking and eating with their family, and to enjoy the value of the food they ate. The sugar pushers were tried along with the drug dealers and sentenced to work in nature until they forgave themselves. All these things changed, And as they changed, so too did the populace. Historians and archaeologists of their future would refer to this as the Second Age of Enlightenment. The people had been known as Homo sapiens, now evolved into Homo spiritualis. The important shift was to self-knowing. In the old days, they'd been herded like sheep through life at high speeds. The quicker you made people run, the greedier you forced them to be, the more you detached them from their true selves, the easier it was to control them. Now, with time on their hands and a good pinch of hindsight, people were able to go deeply inside themselves. They discovered the true meaning of their lives. They discovered that they were consciousness, and that when they'd always looked outside for a God to save them, that they had been this God all along. They were the consciousness of the universe, and as such, they were able to create the perfect lives for themselves. As all populations do in nature, they were self-regulating. Over the centuries, 8 billion became 4 billion. Now people understood about living in harmony with each other and with the land. No more wars, no more famine. When one understood the nature, the natural cycle of life and death, then all fear disappeared. It was understood that death was only a cessation of the concept of time. They understood that their energy continued uninterrupted forever and always. After the struggle of birth, eventually was born an unparalleled time of harmony for this parallel universe. But as we know, every yin must have its yang. But every yang also has its yin. Hao Le, which is Chinese for everything is good already.